In the vast galaxy of Aladora, war had become a way of life. Alien factions fought for control over planets, resources, and power. Among the most feared were the mercenaries, battle-hardened warriors from all over the galaxy, trained in combat, survival, and destruction. They were known for their ruthless efficiency. The mercenaries gathered in a dark, dimly lit room aboard a massive starship, preparing for a new mission. The air was thick with tension, but this wasn't the usual kind of anxiety. Something was different today, something none of them had seen before. The room was silent, save for the quiet hum of the ship's engine. Every mercenary sat with their eyes focused on their leader, a towering figure named Kalen. He was an experienced warrior, scarred by countless battles. His reputation was built on his ability to lead and survive. But even Kalen was on edge. His sharp, calculating eyes darted over the room, scanning his crew as they prepared their weapons. Then, a whisper. One word, spoken by a voice in the back of the room. Earthborn. The effect was immediate. The silence deepened, growing heavier. Kalen's hand, which had been resting on the table, slowly tightened into a fist. He looked around, his eyes dark with a mixture of fear and anger. One by one, the mercenaries lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact. Some even looked as if they were ready to leave the room. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Earthborn. The name had a dark power in the galaxy. It was a name that brought fear, not just because of its meaning, but because of the reputation it carried. Kalen knew the story, of course. He had heard the rumors. The Earthborn were humans, but not like any humans he had ever encountered. They weren't like the weak, primitive species that the galaxy had grown used to seeing. No, the Earthborn were different. They were warriors, trained in ways that made even the toughest alien soldiers tremble in fear. Kalen had seen it once. Years ago, during a raid on a planet that had been taken over by a different mercenary group, he had witnessed the destruction caused by a single Earthborn soldier. It had been swift, brutal, and without mercy. Kalen had never forgotten the sight of that soldier. The way he moved, like a ghost, faster than anyone could track, his eyes cold and unfeeling. The entire mercenary group had been wiped out in a matter of hours. Kalen and his crew barely escaped with their lives. But that had been a long time ago, and many had dismissed the Earthborn as nothing more than a legend. Kalen himself had begun to believe they were nothing more than stories told to scare young soldiers. Until now, the mention of their name brought back all the memories, all the fear he had tried to bury. It was clear that his crew felt the same. Some of them were even starting to shift uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if they wanted to leave. Kalen stood up, his chair scraping across the floor as he pushed it back with a force that echoed in the room. He needed to regain control. He couldn't let the fear of Earthborn units spread among his men. "Get a grip," he snapped, his voice low but sharp. "We're mercenaries. We faced worse than stories and legends." But deep down, even Kalen wasn't sure if that was true. The stories about Earthborn units weren't just rumors. They were based on cold, hard facts. There were survivors from those encounters, survivors who had spoken of the Earthborn warriors in hushed tones, eyes wide with terror. Those who had come face to face with them didn't live to tell the tale often. Kalen had heard the stories from a soldier who had barely escaped the wrath of an Earthborn soldier. The man had been so shaken that he couldn't speak for days. When he finally did, he only muttered a single word: death. The mercenaries shifted uneasily in their seats. Kalen could feel the growing tension. The room was filled with uncertainty, and no one seemed willing to break the silence. A low murmur rippled through the crew, and Kalen's eyes narrowed. He could see fear in their eyes, fear that wasn't easy to disguise. And he understood it. Deep down, Kalen knew that facing an Earthborn soldier wasn't something any of them had prepared for. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves. "We're not children here. We know what we signed up for. Fear won't get us anywhere," We need to focus. But even as he spoke, Caden couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. The Earthborn units weren't just another enemy. There was something different. Something beyond the understanding of even the most seasoned mercenaries. The crew fell silent once again, and Kalen looked at each of them carefully. They weren't afraid of just any soldier. They were afraid of Earthborn. Kalen could feel the weight of that fear pressing down on him, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what would happen next. The mission they had been assigned was dangerous, yes, but there was something more at play here. Something far darker than they had anticipated. As the door slid open and the crew began to file out, Kalen stayed behind. He needed to think. The name Earthborn echoed in his mind over and over again. He couldn't escape it, and as he stared out into the cold void of space, he realized that this was no ordinary mission. They weren't just going up against a fleet of alien invaders. They were up against something far more terrifying. Something that whispered the word Earthborn in fear. Kalen paced back and forth in the dimly lit room, his mind racing. The crew had scattered, each mercenary retreating to their own quarters, clearly rattled by the mention of Earthborn units. Kalen couldn't blame them. He himself had barely been able to shake the fear that had settled in his gut. The word Earthborn had haunted him since his first encounter with them. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some random group of soldiers. There was something much more dangerous. But what exactly made them so terrifying? What could possibly give a group of elite mercenaries such an overwhelming sense of dread? He stopped pacing and stared out of the window, watching the stars drift by. His thoughts returned to the past, to the time when he had first seen an Earthborn soldier in action. It had been on the planet Gorstri, during a mission that was supposed to be a simple raid. But everything had gone horribly wrong. Kalen had been leading his crew through a dense forest, closing in on an alien fortress, when the Earthborn soldier appeared. No warning, no announcement, just a shadow in the trees. The soldier moved with a speed and precision that Kalen had never seen before. It wasn't just the way he fought. It was the way he existed, like a force of nature. The Earthborn soldier didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He simply moved, and with each movement, he brought death. The mercenaries who were with Kalen had never stood a chance. One by one, they fell. The Earthborn soldier never gave them an opening. Kalen had only survived because he was fast, faster than most, and even then, it had been pure luck. As he remembered that encounter, Kalen's mind shifted to the present. What had become of the Earthborn units? Were they still active? Why had they remained hidden for so long, only now to resurface on Aladora? He needed answers. Kalen wasn't one to chase myths, but something told him that the Earthborn were no myth. And if they were back, then they were here for a reason. It was then that Kalen received an unexpected transmission. His second-in-command, Riva, had located something on Aladora, a clue. Kalen's heart raced. He had to know what it was. Grabbing his weapons and gear, he stormed out of his quarters and made his way to the briefing room, where Riva and the others were waiting. Riva was already there, her face grim. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "We found something," she said, her voice low and serious. "I think it's what we've been looking for." Kalen raised an eyebrow. "What did you find?" Riva slid a holographic map across the table. "It's an old military facility, buried deep in the mountains of Aladora. It's been abandoned for years, but something's been happening there. We've intercepted strange signals, encrypted messages. It's like someone is hiding something." Kalen leaned over the map, his eyes narrowing. The facility in question was located in a remote area of the planet, far from the usual battlefields. But that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was the fact that the Earthborn units had been known to operate in secrecy, staying hidden until they were needed. Could this facility be one of their secret bases? "I'm guessing you think it's Earthborn related," Kalen said, his voice edged with suspicion. Riva nodded. "It's the only explanation that makes sense." The encrypted signals, we've traced them to that location. And we also found traces of Earthborn technology, though it's unlike anything we've seen before. Kalen felt a chill run down his spine. The Earthborn didn't just have advanced technology, they had something else, something that made them impossible to predict. And now, it seemed, they were operating right under their noses. "We need to go there," Kellen said, his voice firm. "Now." River didn't hesitate. "I've already prepared a team. We'll head out immediately." The mercenaries quickly gathered their equipment, and soon they were aboard their ship, heading toward the mountains of Aladora. The journey was tense, each member of the crew aware that they were heading into unknown territory. None of them knew exactly what they would find when they arrived, but they knew one thing for sure: Earthborn units were not something you could take lightly. As they neared the facility, the ship's sensors began to pick up strange anomalies. The signals that Riva had detected earlier were growing stronger, more concentrated. It was clear that they were getting close. But what would they find? Would the Earthborn soldiers be waiting for them? Or was there something even more dangerous hidden within the facility? Kalen stood at the front of the ship, staring at the dark silhouette of the mountain ahead. The feeling of dread that had plagued him earlier returned in full force. This mission wasn't just about taking out a few alien invaders. This was something much bigger, something far more dangerous. "We're almost there," Riva said, her voice tight with anticipation. Kalen nodded, his grip tightening on the railing. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but whatever it was certain to change everything. The Earthborn weren't just a legend. They were real, and they were back. The question now was, why? And what would they do if they discovered Earthborn soldiers were already hunting on Aladora? The ship descended toward the facility, the darkness swallowing them whole. Kalen's heart beat faster with each passing second. Whatever happened next, it was going to be something they couldn't escape. The Earthborn had come to Aladora, and now they would have to face the truth about why they were so feared. The ship settled softly onto the rocky surface near the old facility, the low hum of the engines powering down. The air outside was cold, thin, and carried the scent of ozone and decay. The facility loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette cutting against the dim light of Aladora's setting twin suns. It was ancient, built during a war long forgotten, and it had been abandoned years ago. But now it felt alive, as though it was waiting for them, its secrets buried deep beneath the cracked, rusted exterior. Kalen and his crew stepped off the ship, their boots crunching on the gravel beneath them. The wind howled through the barren landscape, carrying the echoes of something far older than them. The team moved quickly, their shadows stretching long in the fading light, every footstep cautious, every breath shallow. The place felt wrong. There was a weight in the air, a tension that they couldn't shake. Kalen kept his hand on the hilt of his weapon, his eyes scanning the surroundings, alert for any movement. He wasn't sure why, but he felt as though they were being watched. He wasn't alone in that feeling. Riva, his second in command, kept glancing over her shoulder, her expression tight with suspicion. "Stay sharp," Kalen muttered, his voice low. "Something's not right here." Riva nodded, her grip on her rifle firm. "I've never seen anything like this. The facility's been dead for years. Why would the Earthborn leave a signal here?" Kalen didn't have an answer. He had never been one for superstition, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. This was no ordinary mission. There was something deeper at play, something far darker than they had anticipated. As they approached the entrance, the heavy metal doors creaked open as if they had been waiting for them. The sound echoed through the cold silence, a long, drawn-out groan that set Kellen's teeth on edge. They stepped inside. The interior of the facility was just as unsettling as the outside. It was dark, with flickering lights casting long shadows across the walls. The place was a maze of corridors, empty rooms, and long-abandoned technology. But in the air, there was a faint hum, almost imperceptible, but enough to make their hairs stand on end. Something was active here, even if they couldn't see what it was. It was like the building itself was breathing, waiting. "Spread out," Callan ordered. "We need to find out what's causing the signal. Reva, take your team and head down to the lower levels. I'll go with the others and check the upper floors." Without a word, the crew split into two groups, moving silently through the labyrinth of corridors. The lower levels were said to contain the old laboratories, where weapons and technology had been developed during the last war. Kaelin's team moved cautiously through the upper floors, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust that covered everything. They didn't speak, each of them focused on the task at hand, but the unease in the air was palpable. Every creak of metal, every flicker of light, seemed to heighten their tension. They found nothing. The rooms they searched were empty, lifeless. The computers were powered down, their screens cracked and covered in layers of grime. But the hum, the faint, electric hum, was growing louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere below them. Without warning, the lights above flickered violently, and then everything went black. A soft hiss echoed through the walls, and the sound of heavy machinery started up, low and mechanical. The hum had turned into a full-blown thrum, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. "What the hell was that?" one of Callan's soldiers muttered. Callan motioned for them to stay quiet, his eyes narrowing in the darkness. He motioned for them to move toward the sound. Whatever it was coming from below them. The team descended a staircase, their weapons drawn, their breaths coming in quick bursts. As they reached the bottom, the light began to flicker back on, slowly at first, then suddenly illuminating a massive chamber. The room was huge, filled with rows of old machinery, vats of liquid that were half covered in dust, and metal structures that looked like they were made to house something large, something powerful. In the center of the room stood a large metallic door, and as they moved closer, Callan could see that the door was slightly ajar. A rush of cold air hit them as the door creaked open. Behind it lay a chamber that had been sealed off from the rest of the facility, its walls covered in strange symbols Callan didn't recognize. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals and decay, and the room itself seemed to pulse with energy, almost as though it was alive. The team moved in cautiously, weapons raised, every sense on high alert. But what they found inside was nothing short of a nightmare. In the center of the room was a massive tank, and inside it, suspended in the murky liquid, were what looked like bodies, humans, but not quite. They were pale, their skin almost translucent, their bodies covered in strange, jagged markings. They looked like experiments, twisted versions of the Earthborn soldiers Callan had heard about. These weren't just warriors. There was something more, something that had been altered, changed. The very air around them seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, as if the creatures in the tank were still alive, still conscious. Callan's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell are these?" he whispered. Riva, who had joined him in the chamber, stared at the figures in the tank, her face pale. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking. "But I think these were the Earthborn soldiers, before they became what they are now." Callan's mind raced. These weren't just soldiers. These were experiments. These were the origins of the Earthborn units, and whatever had been done to them, whatever had been created here, was beyond anything they could have imagined. Suddenly, a noise echoed behind them. Footsteps. Callan spun around, his rifle raised, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no time to think. Something was coming. Something far more dangerous than they had prepared for. The door slammed shut behind them. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, echoing through the dark, metallic chamber. Callan's pulse raced. His crew, now fully alert, raised their weapons, but the sudden shift from tense silence to panic was almost unbearable. The low hum of machinery filled the air again, this time louder, as if something had been activated. There was no turning back now. "Get to the door," Callan shouted, rushing toward the entrance. But before they could reach it, the ground beneath them trembled. The air crackled with static, as a series of lights flickered on along the walls. They revealed more of the chamber's terrifying contents. Additional tanks lined up along the walls, each holding more of the twisted, altered bodies, all eerily still. But now, Kalen could see faint movements, tiny twitches in the bodies. They weren't dead, not completely. Riva's voice trembled as she called out from behind him, "Kalen, look." He turned just in time to see one of the bodies in a tank stir. At first, it was a subtle movement, a hand twitching, a breath that could barely be seen. Then more of them began to shift, their limbs jerking as if they were waking up from a long slumber. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the chamber, and Callan felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alien. It was something in between, a thing born from an unnatural mix of genetic experiments and twisted science. The bodies inside the tanks were alive, but they weren't in control. Whatever had happened to them, whatever these Earthborn soldiers had become, it was beyond anything Callan had ever seen. "Get back," Callan barked, pulling his team away from the tanks, instinctively taking the lead. He had seen his share of battle, but nothing had prepared him for this nightmare in the making. Suddenly, the loud hum intensified, and the floor beneath them began to vibrate violently. A blinding light filled the room, and with it came a series of mechanical whirs and hissing sounds, like something waking up from a deep slumber. The tanks began to hiss as they released vapor, the liquid inside draining away, leaving behind the bodies. And then, as if they were in sync, the creatures, these twisted Earthborn soldiers, opened their eyes. Kalen felt his heart stop. Their eyes were cold, glowing with an unnatural metallic light. They were no longer human. They were something else entirely. "Move, now," Callan shouted. He barely had time to react before one of the creatures, now fully awake, slammed against the side of its tank. The glass shattered with a deafening crack, and the thing inside surged forward with incredible speed, its movements unnatural and terrifyingly precise. The creature's body, once human, had been stretched and contorted by the experiments. Its muscles were larger, its skin covered in thick, jagged patterns. It wasn't just strong, it was lethal. Without hesitation, the creature lunged at the team. Riva fired first, her rifle discharging a barrage of rounds. The bullets hit the creature's chest, but they barely seemed to slow it down. It screeched, an awful, guttural sound, and swiped at her with its massive, claw-like hands. Riva barely managed to duck, but one of the claws sliced through her armor, leaving a gash across her side. "Riva!" Callan shouted, but there was no time. The creature was still coming, relentless. He grabbed Riva, pulling her to safety behind a metal pillar, and fired his own weapon. The shots hit the creature's head, but it didn't go down. Instead, the thing's eyes glowed brighter, almost as if it thrived on the pain. It shrieked again, louder, as more of its kind began to emerge from their tanks, their bodies thrashing violently. Callan's heart pounded. They were surrounded. These weren't just soldiers. They were monsters, born from something twisted and wrong. The Earthborn weren't just elite warriors. They were bioengineered killers, designed for one thing only, to destroy. "Fall back," Callan shouted. "Head for the ship." The team moved as one, but the creatures were faster. They were everywhere now, ripping through the room, their glowing eyes fixed on the mercenaries as if they could sense their fear. Kevin's mind raced, his instincts taking over. They couldn't fight these things head-on. Not like this. The door to the chamber was locked. Callan slammed his fist against the control panel, but nothing happened. The creatures were closing in fast. There was no way out. Riva, still bleeding from her wound, gritted her teeth. "We have to destroy them. We can't let them escape." Callan shook his head. "We don't have the firepower. We need to get out now." As the creatures closed in, Callan felt a deep sense of dread wash over him. The Earthborn had been altered, turned into something unstoppable. And now they were free, unleashed on Alidora. If they couldn't escape this facility, there would be no stopping them. Another creature lunged at Kalen, but this time he was ready. He ducked, sliding beneath its massive claws, and rolled to his feet, firing a round into its side. The creature screamed but didn't fall. It was too strong. Kalen looked to his team. They were holding their ground for now, but he knew it wouldn't last long. If they didn't find a way to stop the Earthborn, the entire galaxy could fall to them. The Earthborn weren't just soldiers, they were weapons, engineered to be the perfect killers. And now they were awake. "We need a plan," Callan yelled, but his words were drowned out by the terrifying sounds of the creature's movements. They were running out of time, and with every passing second, the Earthborn soldiers grew closer to claiming them all. The air was thick with tension as Callan and his team scrambled for their lives. The creatures, these twisted Earthborn soldiers, had them cornered in the chamber, their glowing eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. Every second felt like an eternity as Callan's mind raced for a solution. They were outmatched, outgunned, out of time. If they didn't escape soon, the Earthborn would wipe them out. "Reva, do you have any ideas?" Callan shouted, his voice barely cutting through the chaos as another Earthborn soldier screeched and charged toward them. Reva, still clutching her side, looked back at the shattered control panel. "I'm trying to override the system, but it's locked. These damn creatures have triggered the facility's lockdown. The only way out is through the central control room. It's the last place I haven't accessed yet." Callan's heart raced. The central control room. It was on the other side of the facility, and it was a straight shot through the heart of the Earthborn assault. They would be walking into a trap, but it was the only chance they had. "Then that's where we're going," Callan said, steeling himself. He could feel the weight of his crew's lives on his shoulders, and despite the odds, he wasn't going to let them die in this hellhole. "Cover me," Callan shouted as he sprinted toward the hallway, weapons raised. His team followed closely behind, staying low and firing as the Earthborn soldiers charged at them from every direction. The air was filled with gunfire, the sound of weapons clashing against the creature's armored skin. But none of their shots seemed to do more than stagger the beasts. These Earthborn weren't just soldiers, they were unstoppable forces of destruction. Callan ducked behind a pillar as an Earthborn soldier lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air inches from his face. He fired his rifle point blank into its chest, but it only slowed down for a moment before it roared in anger and attacked again. Callan gritted his teeth and rolled out of the way, narrowly avoiding its deadly strike. "Keep moving," Callan barked. "We have to reach the control room." They pushed forward, but the Earthborn were relentless. They didn't tire. They didn't hesitate. They kept coming, each more terrifying than the last. Every corridor they passed was filled with the sound of those horrible screeches, as if the very walls of the facility were alive with the presence of these creatures. Riva, despite the blood soaking her side, managed to keep up with the rest of the crew. She had her own weapon aimed at the nearest Earthborn, firing shots with deadly precision. The soldiers were strong, but they weren't invincible. Callan had seen Reva take down enemies much more dangerous than this, but even she was starting to tire. "Almost there," Reva shouted, her voice strained. She pressed a button on her wrist console. "I've hacked into the control room system. We're close." But as soon as she spoke those words, the ground shook again, this time more violently. Callan's team stumbled as the facility seemed to tremble with life, the walls groaning as if they were about to collapse. The Earthborn soldiers screeched again, and Callan knew they were closing in. "No, not now," Callan shouted as he looked back toward the hallway. A massive Earthborn soldier, bigger and more terrifying than the others, emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. This one was different. It was almost mechanical in its movements, like a machine made of flesh and bone, its body bristling with spikes and metallic tendrils. Callan's stomach dropped. This was the leader, the one they had been trying to avoid. And now it was here, ready to finish them off. Riva didn't hesitate. We have to stop it. Callan's mind raced. The control room was only a few yards away, but the leader was blocking their path. If they didn't take it down, they wouldn't make it. Cover me, Callan yelled, his voice full of determination. He charged toward the leader, using the chaos of the battle to his advantage. His rifle was useless against it, he knew that. But there was something else. He had a plan. One desperate final move. As the leader's claws swiped toward him, Callan dove beneath it, narrowly missing the deadly strike. With a swift motion, he planted a series of explosive charges along the walls of the hallway, setting them to detonate in a few seconds. "Riva now!" Callan shouted. Riva, understanding immediately, pressed a button on her wrist console, and the facility's power grid blinked as the final override took hold. The control room doors opened with a low hiss. Callan's eyes flicked to the charges. There was no time to waste. With everything in motion, Callan turned and sprinted for the door, the Earthborn leader following close behind. He could hear its heavy footsteps thundering behind him, but he didn't look back. His mind was focused on one thing: survival. As Callan reached the control room, he slammed the door shut behind him. The leader crashed into it moments later, slamming its fists against the thick metal, its screeches echoing through the corridors. Riva quickly accessed the control systems, hacking into the facility's mainframe. "We're not out yet," she said, her voice tense. "I can't shut it all down yet." Callan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He looked at the timer on the charges. It was counting down, the seconds slipping away. He was about to say something when the door behind him exploded outward. The leader had breached the door. "Do it," Callan shouted, ready to face whatever came next. Riva pressed a final key, and the control room flickered to life. The explosive charges detonated, and the facility's walls shook violently. The lights flickered out one last time before everything went dark. Callan and his crew held their breath as the facility seemed to collapse around them. The sound of the Earthborn leader's roar was silenced by the deafening blast, and the shaking of the ground finally stopped. When the dust cleared, Callan slowly opened his eyes. The control room was intact, but the rest of the facility was gone. The Earthborn soldiers had been silenced. For now. But Callan knew this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Whatever experiments had created these Earthborn warriors were far from finished, and they would be back. The galaxy wasn't safe. But for now, they had won. For now, they had survived. "Let's get out of here," Callan said, his voice steady despite the fear that still gripped him. The team nodded in agreement, and they walked toward the exit, knowing that the real battle had only just begun. The Earthborn had been awakened, and now there was no stopping them.